In the world of fiction writing, how much should it matter whether a story is considered realistic or not? We might often hear the argument that discussing realism is pointless when it comes to stories that already contain things like dragons or aliens. Speculative fiction is all made up, so therefore, all consistency and logic within can adhere to whatever the creator wants. This is a very casual line of thought, and it is a very unrefined line of thought. The argument is a huge leap in logic, but why is it though? Fiction is made up, therefore none of it is real. Thus, realism and believability in a fictional work must not be important. Fiction itself is a bunch of untruths that, when collected together, sound nice to the human mind. They cause it to think and feel without actually being real. Even then, somehow, it still matters that stories have consistency and logical progression. Imagine being entertained by a hit blockbuster film in which the characters and story develop as if a 5-year-old were telling you the story, constantly being distracted and inventing drastic and weird plot threads every moment. It might be fun to hear this while you're standing around on a playground or if you're babysitting, but for a story written by an adult, the quality would be far less than standard. Take Jurassic Park, for example. Let's recall the scene in which some of the characters ride around in the cars and pass by the T-Rex enclosure. In this film, we readily believe that dinosaurs can run around and eat whoever they want. It's not a point of contention to the audience when they witness it. Instead, it's part of why they watch the movie. However, if suddenly the cars could lift up from the earth, fly around and shoot lasers to take down the dinosaurs, we'd be more than a little confused. Why though? How much of a stretch would that be? We already have dinosaurs. Why would flying laser cars suddenly be unbelievable in this story? The truth is, realism does factor into the art of storytelling, and there are practical ways to gauge it in order to tell an effective story. To begin with, here's the thing that binds it all together. When you, as an audience member, choose to be entertained by a storyteller, any storyteller, even a 5-year-old, you have entered into what's known as the reader-writer contract. This is a term used in the writing community that refers to a symbiotic bond between the artist and audience, which both are required to uphold. As a part of the audience, anytime you agree to sit down and enjoy a story, you are agreeing to suspend your disbelief and let the storyteller showcase their creation to you. You give them your time, your imagination, and permission to root around within your emotions to create responses and insight. When you, as a writer, bring in a reader, your end of this contract is to chain together a link of events and characters to form a narrative that will resolve itself in a satisfying way. This is done based on the expectations of what your reader is looking for, as well as the kind of story you're willing to tell. You, as the writer, determine your story will fall within the certain boundaries that your audience should be expecting. In doing so, you're able to safely dig into your audience's emotional expectations and play with them throughout the story. Because of this contract, believability in genres such as sci-fi, fantasy, or even magical realism will consist of rules that bridge the imaginary experiences with the real-life ones. The more make-believe a story becomes, the less realistic, but the more elements that are grounded in what we already know as fact or convention, the more realistic. We have to realize that realism in fiction combines these two sets of rules to create a less-more scale and not a binary or yes-no switch. The contract becomes an agreement to see fiction not as fact, but as possible. The official term used for this is verisimilitude, which essentially means the appearance of being true or real, and verisimilitude is vital to all good works of fiction. The story you tell should have the implicit intent of landing somewhere on the realism scale. Depending on your genre or the expectations you've set for your audience, Ending up on unintentional points of the scale may very well breach the reader-writer contract, making your story unrealistic, thus demonstrating a lack of verisimilitude in your work. So, the easiest way to gauge this scale is through the use of rules. I'm going to explain this by depicting two columns on screen. On one side, we have the real-world rules. These are represented by natural laws and human understanding. Fire is hot, nighttime is dark, the clear sky appears blue. These can also be cultural perspectives as well, such as how family and relationships work in the known world, or how politics have been or currently are conducted. On the other side, we have the fictional rules. This is where the imaginative side of the writer gets to come out and play. Here, dragons and starships are invented. In the reader-writer contract, this is what the suspension of disbelief is for. The reader agrees to allow this to happen based on the type of story they wish to see. With all of the rules created in this second column, if they conflict with the rules in the real-world column, these ones will take precedence. So in your fantasy world, fire might not be hot, it might be cool, or the sky might be red instead, and these can be circumstantial or they can be permanent changes to your world. And anything that is not a rule in the fiction column will by default already be represented by the real world column, meaning if the writer makes no rule about water, then water still functions how it normally does. If they make no rule about relationships, then relationships still function how we normally understand them to. Essentially, everything in your story will get sorted into the columns of this is done differently in my world, or this is done just like it is in our world, and that becomes the new reality between you and the reader. This is a crucial part of creating verisimilitude. These rules allow for there to be common understanding and consistency in your story. It is something that readers must willingly give into, and writers must personally uphold all throughout the story. An author breaking the rules of either column without sufficiently creating new rules to explain it makes their story far less believable and realistic. It betrays the trust and understanding between what reader and writer hope to see in the story. If that trust is broken, the writer could say anything and the reader will just shrug and say, I don't really believe you, I don't buy it, it's all just made up anyway. A deus ex machina, for example, shatters the believability for what readers might expect out of a story's resolution. Character work is heavily affected by this as well. I mentioned earlier that these rules also apply to relationship dynamics. These can easily be forgotten in contrast to the more surface-level rules. Human behavior is where many fictional stories will accidentally end up becoming unrealistic. Unless it's demonstrated in the story that certain aspects of human behavior are different, we can rightly assume that normal human interactions as we understand has a place in stories by default. Just like with the real world, if relationships or people develop a certain way, there is a progressive chain of events that lead to that development. It is actually important for us as writers to have a decent grasp of how people behave and respond to situations, allowing for variety when writing realistic character behavior. A kind character accidentally bumps into somebody and will immediately apologize and try to smooth things over. They won't suddenly start a fight because they're a kind character. It would not make any sense. Character arcs are the framework to help simulate the process of getting to know a person's traits and beliefs. As these develop, they will cause characters to take actions and make certain choices. So, any sudden character shifts that appear forced or rushed will then degrade your story's realism. The reader-writer contract can actually break when human behavior is no longer being portrayed accurately, or if such irrationality hasn't been explained sufficiently in the work. In short, if rules aren't followed, the story degrades its level of realism, as depicted on the scale. Some deviations might be forgiven though, especially if deviating from the rules is the intent of the work. We wouldn't hold it against Monty Python and the Holy Grail for its wildly made-up plots. Our leeway for disbelief in a story allows us to acknowledge whatever it is that the writer intends for it. Of course, sometimes writers want their stories to be taken more seriously. In Game of Thrones, when Cersei blows up the Sept of Baelor, hundreds, if not thousands of people are killed, and with very little repercussions. She simply claims the throne without protest. The writing is heavily criticized here, because in the past, the people of King's Landing violently rioted when Joffrey wouldn't feed them. That was an established rule, that the people paid attention when mistreated. So it was inconsistent when not only was the beloved Marjorie killed, but a huge religious site was violently destroyed as well. The people should have been up in arms, or at the very least there should have been an explanation scapegoating someone or something else instead of the crown. And yet conveniently, everyone was silent, which makes the story much less realistic due to the lack of consistency. One might say the writers kind of forgot about the people of King's Landing. So let's talk about how to apply rules on a practical level. When you introduce rules throughout the plot, it should be a very natural and organic thing. The rules of your fantastic elements can all be displayed in scenes that introduce us to the characters or settings. We might see a character create fire from their hands, and that will teach us a new rule about the world we're being introduced to. We might be introduced to a society and find that it is highly structured and militarized. You would expect the fire-wielding character to use that fire against their obstacles throughout the plot. It would be unrealistic if they'd spent the entire story using water instead, or simply forgetting that they had their fire magic. Your military society should be expected to have a strong esprit de corps and skilled warriors within its ranks. It would be unrealistic if they were useless and inept in every scene they showed up in, but still they were somehow touted as an elite and reliable military force. Think about the opening scene to Jurassic Park, in which several employees are trying to effect the transfer of some sort of creature. We of course can assume that it's a dinosaur, and we watch as it brutally attacks one of the employees who happens to get too close to its cage. This scene establishes rules for the world. For one, it tells us that in this fictional story, dinosaurs are part of reality. There is an organization of people handling them, and the dinosaurs can be dangerous if not clever. So as viewers, we expect to see these rules come up in the story again, which they do. Now, this movie doesn't need to establish that water is wet, or cars drive on wheels. We see those in the movie, and can already assume that those are true based on what we know. Like I mentioned at the start of the video, if the cars started to retract their wheels and fly around shooting lasers, we would call the story out for not being believable, even as we remain willing to accept the reality of dinosaurs chasing the characters around, because the rules introduced us to the dinosaurs, while never introducing us to flying laser cars. Ultimately, in the end, it's your job as the writer to set the genre, establish the consistent rules of the world, and guide the expectations of what your readers will be experiencing. This creates the margin for your story's believability on the realism scale. Deviating from that will earn the distrust of the readers, knocking you down along that scale. Falling down too far outside of acceptable margins will make readers say, "I don't believe any of this," and the work may be considered unrealistic according to the realism of the fictional world. So be consistent with all the rules you create. Anything that isn't a fabricated rule defaults to rules that can be applied to regular life. Any inconsistencies that are in the piece must have a sufficient explanation that fits within the rules. Adhering to these will help to create the proper verisimilitude that your story requires. So, what are some ways that you guys have noticed rules being introduced into a work of fiction? How do you go about changing up the realism in your own stories? Please let me know in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, as usual, be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons. Feel free to share the video too if you think others might enjoy it. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.